Letting George Do It by Henry Kitchell Webster, illustrated by May Wilson Preston, first published in the Saturday Evening Post, February 8th, 1913. Melissa should not be allowed to cry. That was an axiom at the foundation of Cosmos. She was too pretty, and it spoiled her looks. When her eyelids got puffy and her nose red, and her delicious little short upper lip, which ought to come curving out under her small nose, began to bulge, you would hardly have known she was a pretty girl at all. George did not like to look at her even when he had not done it. This time he had done it. She had been smiling when she came into his den and sat down on the arm of his chair, though the news she had come to bring him was that both the maids were going to leave. The thing was rather a joke because they were sisters, and they had quarreled as to which sink the silver was to be washed in and which of them was to do it. If there were a third upstairs maid, they represented to Melissa, the matter would be easy of solution. Failing that, they would have to leave. They had quarreled to the point where they would not speak to each other, addressing all their remarks through Melissa, but they were unanimous about this. Melissa had suggested that she keep one of them and let the other find a job somewhere else. But the answer to that was that they could not be separated. They would not work together, but they could not live apart. So there was nothing for it but to let them go. And they were both so good. What is the matter with their solution? George wanted to know. We can afford it, of course. Don't forget that we've struck oil. This month's check was over $3,000. 3 maids for 2 people and a small house are ridiculous, I know, but if it makes things simpler, why not? But it doesn't, cried Melissa. If I got another maid, then I have to hire a housekeeper to keep them busy. It's just impossible any way you try to work it. Oh, and I forgot. You'll have to speak to the new furnace man. He won't empty the garbage pails. He says it isn't his job and that it isn't his fault the house doesn't get warm until 10:30 in the morning. Perhaps if you talk to him, you can make him see things differently. Why in blazes should I talk to him? I haven't anything to do with it. Melissa did not get cross at that, though it was her cue to do so. Instead, she patted George's hand indulgently and laughed. And then she waited a minute, looking down on the top of his head with a thoughtful, cautious expression, as if she were trying to make up her mind whether the dog would bite or not. George, of course, saw nothing of that. Just hopelessly impossible in the suburbs, she said, and then went on with a little rush. But there is a way to be comfortable, Ducky. Let the maids go, and the furnace man too, and call in the plumber to drain the pipes, and go into town and rent the dearest love of an apartment. The dog bit. No, roared George. Melissa turned stately and rose from the arm of his chair. She had not begun to cry yet. I never minded when we were poor, or even when we were comfortable but economizing, having the cook leave and doing the work myself, and spoiling my hands and my complexion and my clothes, and pretending I liked it, so that you wouldn't worry, and peeking through the portiere when the doorbell rang to see whether I dared answer it or whether it was someone come to call. But now we're getting rich. I hate it. It seems as if we might afford to be decently comfortable. And you want to go for comfort to a cooped-up little flat where there isn't room to throw anything or turn round or breathe? Where'd I have my workshop? How could I get any exercise? What if I wanted to bore a hole in anything? This was when Melissa began to cry in a quiet, forlorn little way, so that it was a minute or two before George noticed. But the fact that she did not answer made his victory seem rather cheap. So he went on. Of course, it is ridiculous that we should have to live along never knowing where our next cook is coming from and having the pipes freeze and the furnace threaten to blow up every few days. And never seeing the last act of anything because if we missed the 10:58 and had to stay in town all night, there was no knowing what would happen at home. It's rougher on you, I suppose, than it is on me, though I hadn't thought of that before. But the answer isn't an apartment. He felt rather pleased with the fairness of these remarks until Melissa turned tragically away from the window, sniffled, and applied her wet little wad of a handkerchief to each eye and then to her nose. Then George's heart smote him, so hard that She was out of the room before he could muster a word to say. It was about an hour later that he found her in the kitchen peeling potatoes. "The maids are both going on the noon train," she said, "so I thought I'd better get ready for lunch." The potatoes were knobby and the knife was dull, and George did not like the way it threatened to gash one of her pink fingers every time she brought it round. He reached out and took the potato away from her, and the knife too, and sat down on the table holding her hands. "It isn't being out there in the country you hate, is it?" he asked, "having a big yard and no need to pull down the curtains and lots of room and air. It's the accessories. If the job could be properly done, you wouldn't mind?" "I'd love it," said Melissa. "I suppose I love it anyway." "Well," said George, "I've been thinking it over, and I've decided to find out what's the matter with the job. I'm going to take it myself." Melissa pulled her hands away and got up. "What are you thinking about? What job?" "Running this house, our domestic plant. The system's wrong somehow. I'm going to find out what's the matter with it. I think it will be interesting, and I need a vacation anyway." "So you're going to try your hand at hiring the next cook?" "Hire nothing," said George. "I'm going to be the next cook." Melissa shrugged her shoulders. "If you think it's anything to joke about—" "I was never more serious in my life," he grinned. "If you think," she went on, "that it will help matters any to have you messing around the kitchen for a day or two, breaking half the dishes and getting things into such a state that it will take me 3 days with a cleaning woman before I dare let a new cook come out here, you're very much mistaken. It's ridiculous. You've never cooked anything in your life." "Lots of things," he contradicted, "in the laboratory. Ever so much more dangerous things than potatoes. I guess I can read a cookbook. There can't be any mystery about it. I'm going to see if the combination of a little common sense with a certain amount of scientific intelligence won't accomplish something." "You've got plenty of common sense," he went on hastily, for a sudden gleam in her eyes made him nervous. "But when it comes to scientific intelligence, you don't show. You never started." Melissa took off her big apron. "All right," she assented briefly. "Let's see if your scientific intelligence is up to getting the lunch." George caught the apron as it crumpled to the floor. "At 1:30, he announced firmly, "your lunch will be ready." She watched him buttoning on the apron. He was not quite so clumsy about it as she expected. She could not make up her mind whether to be heartless and laugh, or to be sorry for him and stay indignant. She looked up and seemed Nope. He looked up and seemed surprised that she should still be standing there, but he smiled amiably. "Run along," he said, "but please be prompt at 1:30. That settled it. With a haughty inclination of her beautiful head, she turned and swept from the room. That was how George described it to himself as he heard the door slam. But then his taste in fiction was low. When she had walked half a block, she turned and came back. "Let's not be silly," she said, pausing tentatively in the kitchen doorway. "You can't possibly get lunch. You don't know where anything is." George looked at her and made his eyes glare and his cheeks puff out. "Shoo," he said, "rouse." This time Melissa really was mad. She had only been pretending before. She was going away and she was not coming back, at least not to eat his ridiculous lunch. She would catch the 11:17 into town and shop apartments. She would get Florence to go with her, and they could have lunch together. Perhaps when she came home at night, he would be tired of his joke. Suppose he did manage to have an edible meal ready at 1:30, though. It was impossible, of course, but would it not be better to be on hand at the exact hour and gloat over him? If he got into enough of a mess, perhaps he'd be willing to go to town with her on the 222 and look at apartments himself. Anyway, Florence was in the hands of a dressmaker and could not go. Florence's new frock was rather exciting, and the question whether you should get that new draped-in effect round the knees with a rigid braid or with a band of garter rubber sewed on inside was so absorbing, with its various corollaries and connotations, that Melissa forgot all about George and narrowly missed being late for lunch. She made it, though, by half a minute and walked hurriedly into the dining room with her coat and hat on. Now, here is where you are going to be surprised, because you are expecting just what Melissa did. You think this paragraph is going to contain a lurid account of chaos, of greasy black smoke settling in the curtains, of sticky liquids dripping from shelves and tables onto the floor, of a saffron nimbus of profanity floating above the head of poor George, who has been overtaken by poetic justice for his rash invasion of woman's sphere, and who, when his wrath has cooled, will humbly ask to be forgiven. Melissa was so clear about this. She had her kind little words of condolence so well rehearsed that it was rather a shock to her to find the house looking as usual. The next thing she noticed was that the dining table was set for one. The worst of it was correctly set. George came in and pulled her chair back for her. "How about you?" she asked. "It was your lunch that was to be at 1:30, he told her. "I've had mine." The lunch consisted of bouillon, creamed eggs, salad, and cheese, and there was coffee afterward. Melissa ate it course by course in the silence of stupefaction. "Well," she sighed as he poured her coffee into a small cup, "I don't see how you did it, but I'm not going to apologize until I've seen the kitchen. Come along, let's wash up. I don't care how bad the kitchen is," she went on, for a peremptory gesture had arrested her. "The lunch was worth it." "It was a pretty good lunch," he admitted, "although it was rather low in carbohydrates. But that won't hurt you. You're going to be fat if you don't look out." "Just for that," observed Melissa after an ominous silence, "you can wash up the dishes yourself, and I don't care what the kitchen looks like." "Precisely," said George, "and you aren't going to know until I've got this job finished." "How long do you think it's going to take?" "I don't know, probably longer than I thought. I'm inventing a potato peeler just now, and I expect I'll have to write a cookbook, unless there's one somewhere that's written by a man." "Oh," cried Melissa, "you're simply—" And again she swept majestically toward the door. "Let me know now if you're having anyone to tea," said George calmly. "And dinner will be at 11, as usual. I'm sorry, dinner will be at 7, as usual." She called him up from Florence's about 4 o'clock to say that she wouldn't be back for tea. She had meant to stay home, to be ready to rush to the rescue the moment he flew distress signals. She'd gone to the kitchen door 2 or 3 times, but the disconcerting silence out there had been too much for her courage. If only he would smash a dish. So she went back to Florence. "Perhaps it's just as well," he said over the phone when she told him she was not coming back. "I'm pretty busy." "Got the dishes washed up yet?" asked Melissa. "And don't you want me to help with the dinner?" He did not want any help with the dinner, it seemed, and he was downright evasive about the lunch dishes. If she would be back sharp at 7, that was all he wanted. "It's going to be a really good dinner, and it's likely to be the last one you'll get at home for some time." No, he was not getting tired of the job and going to quit, but after today he was going to be too busy to cook much. There should always be a bit for her, of course. Well, there was nothing to be got out of him over the telephone, that was clear, especially with Florence there listening and wondering what it was all about. Melissa controlled her curiosity until 6. Then she went home and walked straight out into the kitchen. George had on a suit of overalls and was slicing an onion, derisively reading aloud the while from a cookbook which lay propped open before him with a monkey wrench. Also, he was smoking a pipe, and the kitchen was blue and brown with it. But it wasn't George that caused her gasp of horror. The person he was reading aloud to was Florence's husband. He was smoking a cigar. He was sprawled out over the table in his shirt sleeves with a pencil and a pad of paper, and he was gazing with a thoughtful eye at the open doorway to her pantry, from which there exuded a miscellaneous heap of kitchenware, frying pans, stew pans, boilers, blazers. The whole kitchen was horrible to look at, with its own little litter rampant everywhere, and a different litter of George's importation superimposed. But the particular part of it that Florence's husband was gazing at in that fascinated sort of way was the worst. Melissa, as I said, gasped and stood there staring. She gave Jerry, that was Florence's husband's name, a little bow and then turned on George. She wasn't quite sure whether she could control her voice or not. Also, there were tears that were going to spill over in a minute. "I'd like," she said, "to speak to you a minute, George." "You'll spoil the brown sauce if you keep me too long," he began when he had followed her into the room she could not break him of calling the parlor. She had gone in there because it was the farthest away from the kitchen, but it would have taken more than brown sauce to divert Melissa. She closed the door behind him. Then, her blue eyes dark with tragic indignation, she turned on him. "I never knew you to do a downright mean thing before. You're silly sometimes and stupid. I suppose all men are. But this is the first really low-down thing I've ever known you to do, and I don't see how you could." "When you tell me what it is I've done," said George politely, but really because he was cross and knew that tone made her wilder than anything else. At least, that was Melissa's explanation. "Then perhaps I may be able to explain. Didn't you tell Jerry what you're doing, cooking my meals and washing my dishes? Didn't you deliberately take him out to the kitchen and show him? I suppose you'll say it was time to get dinner when he came and that you hadn't any other place to take him. What if it was time to get dinner? Do you suppose I'd have minded if it had been late? That horrible kitchen! And he'll go home and tell Florence, and tomorrow it'll be all over town. Oh, and you needn't pretend you weren't laughing, because I saw you." "We laughed," said George, "in order not to weep. We were horrified, really. I never suspected before what a frightful place a kitchen is, and neither did Jerry. It's simply medieval." "Huh," sniffed Melissa. "Does Jerry think that Florence's is any better? Or would be after he'd been messing around in it all day?" "No," said George. "It was the thought that this one was probably as good as any in town that really made us sick." Melissa observed frostily that she did not see it, that it was any business of Jerry's anyway. "That's exactly what it is," said George. "Business. He didn't drop in. I sent for him professionally. This thing is going enough beyond my depths so that I wanted his services as a consulting electrical engineer. I've got to pay him $50 a day. We're going to the bottom of this business. We're starting a new epoch. That's what we're doing." The new epoch did not impress Melissa very much, but the $50 a day did. When she discovered that George meant it, that it was not just a low masculine joke, the notion of paying a man $350 a week to work in her kitchen, a man, mind you, who didn't begin to know as much about such things as an ordinary $7 cook, reduced her to a comparative speechlessness that gave George his opportunity. "That's the point," he said. "Exactly. The wisdom of the $7 cook has been the sieve that everything in the kitchen has been strained through. If a man made any appliance, it had to be something that would appeal to her. Some of them are ingenious enough, but nothing has any relation to anything else. The cooks themselves, professional and amateur, have accumulated a lot of facts, how to make short pie crust and chicken a la king, but they never put two and two together. There's nothing really complicated about cooking. You have to apply heat to things to make them fit to eat, and then you have to put things in to make them taste good, salt, and so on. But the trouble is that none of your appliances really applies. Nothing is where you want it. You break your back leaning over a sink and almost get a stroke of apoplexy trying to look into the oven, which is 15 inches above the floor, and where no light can possibly shine into it anyway. Everybody knows that water doesn't dissolve fats, yet women have gone on for 1,000 years trying to get greasy dishes clean by putting them in a pan of warm water and swabbing them with a rag. Then they empty the water down the drain, which the grease clogs up, and hang up the rag to dry. It began to look as if George had forgotten about the brown sauce himself. "Now," he went on, "Jerry and I are going at this as if it were any other sort of manufacturing proposition. He's going to attend to the electrical end of it. That's the only way, of course, of handling power, or heat. It comes to the same thing, discontinuously. And the essence of the domestic problem is that it is discontinuous. You never want anything wrong. I'm going to look after the efficiency end of it. You get in your raw material and manufacture it. That's cooking. Deliver it to the consumer. That's serving. And dispose of the refuse. And that, except for keeping your house clean and warm, is all there is to it. At that moment, there arose frantic cries from Jerry in the kitchen, their purport being that something in the oven was burning up. There's another thing, said George. Bergson says that what gave us the bulge over the animals was that we could start things going and go away and leave them, while the animals had to stay right on the job till they finished what they had to do. It gave us leisure to use our minds. But women, you see, have had to stay right by the oven door all the time to see the roast doesn't burn. That's why they're so much stronger on instinct than they are on intelligence. That's another thing we'll fix. Melissa flung open the door with a gesture that reminded George of one of those haughty princesses who were always the heroines of his favorite sort of fiction. "Will you go and put out the fire?" she demanded, "or shall I?" "It's just the roast, and I'm afraid it's spoiled by now anyway," sighed George. And then he paused in the doorway. "Look here, why don't you go and dine with Florence? You can tell her that Jerry's going to be working late. When we get through, I'll come down with him and bring you home." "I don't believe I care for any dinner." Melissa spoke with quiet dignity, but the throaty quaver in her voice would have melted George's heart if he had heard Ethel Barrymore do it on the stage. "I think I'll just go to bed." He might have shown a little remorse at that, but he didn't. He positively brightened up. "That'll simplify things quite a lot," he observed as he started down the hall. But when he had gone a pace or two, he stopped again. "There's some sort of patent biscuit I found in the pantry, and it says on the box that one of them contains as much nourishment as half a pound of porterhouse steak. Perhaps if I got you one of those." "Those were got for Fido," said Melissa icily. "I used to try to get him to eat them, but the poor little dear never would. So I don't believe you need bring one to me." She ran in to say goodbye to Florence next morning on her way to the 11:17. "Oh, we only decided on it in a hurry last night," she explained. "The mother has been at me to come for ever so long. But both the maids left yesterday and the house is all torn up. So we thought it would be a good time for it." "But," gasped Florence, "what is poor George going to do with no cook in the house like that?" "Poor George says he's going to have the time of his life." "Well, we shall do our best to make him comfortable." "That's lovely of you, dear," said Melissa. Section 2. Melissa's mother was a perfect housekeeper, which is probably one reason why perfect housekeeping had never made a very vivid appeal to Melissa. There never was a servant problem at Mother's home. Her cook had worked for her 27 years. The second maid, a mere upstart, 20. While the coachman looked down on both of them from the pinnacle of 30 years of service. To Melissa, during her 6 hours' ride on the train, this seemed like a port after storms. She saw now that she had never appreciated it when it was her own home. She had not appreciated her mother either. Could she remember in all those years a single thing going wrong? An even momentary lapse into chaos such as she and George had been slipping into all the time? No, she could not. How was it done? And why in the world had she not learned the secret from her mother long ago, before... Melissa let her breath catch and only managed to swallow a sob because the woman across the aisle was looking at her. Before it was too late. Because of course it was. Things could never be the same between her and George again. But she'd make her mother tell her the secret anyway. Let her practice it, so that when George had shown himself properly contrite, she would be in a position to go back and show him. She waited a week, but at the end of that time, there being no sign of a proper state of mind in George, she told her mother all about it. She supposed it had been really her own fault. Of course, George had been silly and said and done outrageous things, but perhaps she had driven him to it, and she wanted to learn how to do better. Her mother rather surprised her by agreeing with her about that. Of course, a man in a kitchen was a mere bull in a china shop. Women had an instinct for such things, a foreordained a priori knowledge providentially bestowed, which it was downright irreligious for a man to question. But if the angel of the house had allowed her instinct to become dormant, as was the case with Melissa, and did not tread her own quarter-deck with any assurance, you could not blame a man for being a fool and rushing in. Those were not her mother's words exactly, but that was the general idea. Melissa swallowed it dutifully, though it was not palatable. It sounded too much like what George had said about Bergson and the animals. The secret, my dear Melissa, is in 2 words: regularity and persistence. 3 times since you came, you have been late for the meal, twice for breakfast, and once for dinner. Ellen has really been upset about it. You can't expect the servants to do their part unless you do yours. I don't believe that I've been late to a meal for 20 years. But, Melissa protested, you don't always want your breakfast at the same time. How can you tell when you want it until you find out how wide awake you are in the morning? And of course, there are times when you simply have to be late for dinner. I know, her mother assented. I felt the same way at your age, but man, my dear child, is a creature of habits. Not George, Melissa interrupted. He never cares whether things are on time or not. A creature of habits, her mother proceeded firmly. They may be irregular, careless habits, or they may be very different. What sort they are will depend very largely on his wife. If she gives him the right sort of habits, he will find that she is necessary to him. And just in proportion as she is necessary to him, she will be a happy woman. Melissa thought that over for a while. I see, she mused at last. I never thought you were so clever, Mother. I always thought I was cleverer than you. But I never could have thought of that. You mean that it's up to me to get George into a set of habits that will make him perfectly helpless without me. When he's like that, I'll have him where I want him. Never in my life, said her mother severely, have I said anything so slangy, not to say indelicate, as that. It was what she meant, though. I think I'll try to learn, said Melissa, though she repeated with a burlesque shiver, persistence and regularity. The postcard she got next morning from George clinched her resolution. We are making mistakes, of course, he wrote, but we're on the right track. Flexible and discontinuous, that's our motto, and we're going to get it. The expression on her mother's face, when Melissa read that to her, spoke volumes. Flexible and discontinuous. She did not know exactly what he meant by it, but it sounded dangerous. He'll be wanting his marriage to be flexible and discontinuous next, she observed. Melissa spent the rest of the day blistering her fingers, laming her wrist, and scorching her face in an attempt to make apple dumplings. If she could make the only sort of apple dumplings George liked, and if he got so that he could not be happy unless he had them every Saturday night, it was clear that to that extent at least she would have George. She went at other things besides cooking, too. Got hints on bed making, dusting, dishwashing, and so on from her mother. There should be nothing in the whole domestic bag of tricks that she did not know when she went back to George. He would not like it at first. It took time to form the right sort of habits, and she had wasted previous years. But from now on, the Medes and the Persians would have nothing on Melissa when it came to establishing an inflexible routine. She worked so hard, she worried her mother, until one day a postcard came from George that read like this. Gee, but it will be good to have you back. When I think about you getting off the train in that dinky little new blue suit of yours with the fur trimming around it, I quit thinking I'm tired and put in another hour's work. But don't you dare come till I telegraph. She slowed down a little on the cooking and dusting after that, and took to brushing her hair religiously 100 strokes every night. Also, she sent a mail order for her own particular sort of cold cream. Consequently, when she did get off the train at last, in the new blue suit George had specified, though her stock of domestic lore was undoubtedly greater than when she went away, she was rather more sharply aware that she had never looked any prettier in her life than she did right then. And if the expression she saw on his face were any criterion, she certainly looked good to George. He took her to a jeweler's and bought her one of those gold chain bags, and then to an expensive place without music for luncheon. And after that, to her surprise, suggested they go to a matinee. But if we're to have dinner at home and you happen to cook, hadn't we better go straight home and begin getting it? Because we can't get home from the matinee before 6:30. That's all right, George assured her. You don't want dinner before 7, do you? You'll have plenty of time to wash up. Oh, of course, hazarded Melissa. You've asked Florence to go over and have things ready for me. Not on your life, said George. Florence will hardly speak to me these days because I won't let Jerry tell her what we've been doing. You duck, Melissa called him and furtively squeezed his hand. So they went to a nice dark matinee and caught the 5:47 in a taxi. There was a blur over Melissa's eyes when she walked into the house that was not wholly due to the snapping cold outside. It had been nearly 3 months since she had gone storming out that morning on her way to her mother's, and it seemed pretty good to her to be back. In order not to be silly, she said something sensible. You've got a good furnace man at last. Having it warm like this when there's been no one here all day. There isn't any furnace man, George told her. That's one of the anachronisms we've abolished. What's more, the house has been cold ever since I went into town this morning. Just above freezing. It began to heat up an hour ago. He cut short her questions. There were not to be any explanations until the next morning. When she had had a dinner and a breakfast under the new regime, and had said whether she liked them, then she could be shown how it was done. He was very high-handed about it, and she went upstairs with a wicked hope that things would go just a little wrong, at least, to take him down a peg. She extended the process of washing up to include putting on one of her prettiest evening frocks. She happened to have one that she could get into without assistance. And George had been playing loud things on the piano player for quite 10 minutes when she appeared in the stairway. But the way he looked at her was highly satisfactory. The dining room gave her her first gasp. Poor Melissa had a good many gasps coming. The round table was replaced by one built in the shape of a letter U. The hollow part of the letter was filled up by a tea wagon with a glass top. On it was a Sheffield soup tureen. Their places were set side by side round the curve. When she sat down, she noticed a new built-in sideboards and that the swing door into the butler's pantry had been replaced by one that slid. She looked appealingly at George, but his face was adamant. Eat it while it's good, he commanded with a gesture toward the soup. She obeyed and burned her tongue on it, and she had kept him waiting 10 minutes. Flexible, observed George, and discontinuous. Did you notice your bed while you were up dressing? It was made in a queer way. I didn't take time to notice it especially. What about it? It's the first properly made bed since our grandmothers gave up goose feathers. There's a flap on the bottom of the mattress, sewed to a sort of frame that grips the sheets and blankets like a trouser stretcher. With my patent bed maker, I've made it in 48 seconds. It can't pull out at the bottom, and the box plate near the foot gives room for your feet. You can push it right back against the wall because no matter how wide it is, it can be made from one side. How was the soup? I suppose it would have been delicious, said Melissa, if I hadn't burned my tongue. Her husband laid his watch beside her on the table. Now, he said, please time me. He put their soup plates on the tea wagon with the tureen, stepped on something that made the door open, and wheeled the wagon out into the kitchen. The door closed apparently all by itself the moment he had gone through. The thing was a sort of game. She glanced at the watch, though she had not meant to. In less than 30 seconds, the door opened again and he wheeled the tea wagon back. The roast was on it, and 2 vegetables, and hot plates. He could not possibly have said it like that. Got the roast on the platter, the vegetables into their dishes, and so on, while he was out there. Yet it was all hot, right to the minute. "Someone else is out there," said Melissa, pushing back her chair, intent on surprising the intruder and on unmasking George. He held up his right hand. "Nobody but myself," he said, "has been in that kitchen for 4 days." Florence and Jerry came in just then, rather tactlessly, Melissa thought, to welcome her home. They stayed for coffee and a while after that, and while Florence was telling all about her new clothes, the men disappeared for 10 minutes or so with their cigarettes. After they had gone, Melissa went up to George and took him by the lapels. "You'll let me come out into the kitchen now, won't you, and help wash up? You won't make me sit in here all by myself while you do it." "Oh, that was done long ago," he told her. "Jerry and I attended to it while we were smoking our cigarettes. And I got breakfast, too." He did not see why she should have turned away with that funny-sounding laugh just then. But she turned back to him the next minute, and there was nothing the matter with her looks. No, she certainly looked good to George. "In the first place," he explained, when they had finished breakfast the next morning, "we haven't been nearly so radical as we might have been. For instance, we've left the rugs and the curtains, when it's obvious that the scientific way would have been to have your floors perfectly bare and smooth and wear your rugs around with you. That is, wear carpet slippers over your shoes. And instead of curtains, there ought to be shades of glass and metal. But there will be much less dust anyway because of there being no fires and because all the air that gets into the house is filtered." "No fires!" gasped Melissa. "Except the garbage incinerator," said the accurate George. "Come along, we'll begin down in the cellar." The furnace was gone, and the coal bins. The floor was paved with cement, and the windows were bright and clean. He pointed out the garbage incinerator. "It's water jacketed, you see, and that furnishes part of the hot water supply." There was a dumbwaiter beside it that came down from the kitchen, and on the other side of that was a piece of machinery that drew a look of troubled wonder from Melissa. "Oh, that," said George, "is the refrigerating plant. Ice is almost as much of a nuisance as fires. It's perfectly simple. Just a motor and an air compressor. Compressing heats the air, you see, and then it's cooled in a worm and expanded. The worm runs through a tall, slender water tank, and that helps the hot water, too, which I think is rather clever, don't you?" "Yes," said Melissa faintly. "And here," George went on, "is the cool room." He opened a thick door and turned on a light. "We keep this at about 40 degrees. You can keep a whole winter supply of winter vegetables and apples. Buy 'em in the summer when they're cheap. And preserves and canned things. The cold room's on this side for anything you want to keep frozen." "You'll never," cried Melissa, making a clutch at the situation, "get a cook to work where the refrigerator is in the basement, even with the dumbwaiter." "Oh, we pipe to the kitchen too, of course," said George comfortably. "And now, if there isn't anything else you want to ask about, we'll go up there." "No, I don't think there is," said Melissa. She had planned it all out at her mother's, just how she would act when she first saw George's kitchen. She would be kind and open-minded. She would not point out all his ridiculous mistakes at once. She would just take command, secure in her newly acquired knowledge, but without mentioning the source of it. None of the other scenes she had rehearsed had come off, but the kitchen was, according to her mother, her citadel, and she was not the ignorant young thing she had been 3 months ago. She was prepared to defend it against all comers. So she took a long breath and steadied herself. Kind and open-minded, but firm as adamant. That was the idea. Nevertheless, she gasped again at what he showed her, because it was not a kitchen at all. Nothing that any self-respecting woman would call a kitchen. There was no sink, no proper sink that you could wash dishes in. There was no stove. There were no pantries. That sliding door opened straight into the dining room. The place was walled in white tile. Down one side of it ran two plate glass shelves. The lower one, which was broader, was bare, and the upper one had cupboards and other queer-shaped things on it. In another of the walls were several thick little doors, and near them a table with a spring scale on it. George had followed her look. "That's right," he said. "That's where you begin. That's the receiving table. All your raw material comes in here except the milk, which is put through a top-swung door directly into the refrigerator." He opened one of the little doors and showed the bottles standing there. "Everything is checked up, weighed, and so on, and then put away at this end of the room. The essence of modern shop practice is to take your raw material in at one end of your plant and deliver your finished product at the other without any running back and forth. That's the plan I've followed. Ingredients at this end, cooking along the side, service at the other end near the dining room." He showed her the various sized canisters against the wall. "Flour is, of course, sifted direct into the measuring glass. Coffee is ground as it's wanted. For tea, you get enough for 1 cupful every time you press this button. You don't have to dip up anything. When you want to begin to cook, you take one of these movable tables." They were made of white enameled pipe mounted on easy rolling casters and had plate glass tops and a glass bowl held by a hoop at the end. "Collect your ingredients, slipping the table along wherever it's most convenient, and begin." "I know what this place makes me think of now. I've been trying to think. It's like an operating room in a hospital. And these," Melissa's voice went up in a horrified break, "are operating tables." "Well," George admitted with a grin, "I confess that's where I got the idea. But it does deserve the compliment, because it's really clean, and that's something no kitchen has ever been before. Take the garbage, for instance. The tank it's kept in is chilled by a cold air coil to a temperature of 35 degrees. That hardens all the grease, but lets the water drain away. There isn't the slightest odor from it at that temperature. Once a day, it's wheeled over to the dumbwaiter, taken down to the incinerator, and that's the end of it. Take the floor. It's got a slight pitch to the center where there's a recessed drain." George lifted the cover and showed it. "When you want to wash the floor, you turn on that hot water tap, flush it, wipe it down with a rubber squeegee, and it's clean as a dinner plate. And it has to be kept clean because everything shows. There isn't a dark corner in it. There's nothing resting on the floor that can't be instantly moved. There's no place to hide anything. There'll never be a towel or a rag in it, nothing but paper. You use that once and throw it into the tank." Melissa clutched at a straw. "I can just see a cook trying to wash and wipe her dishes with pieces of paper," she observed. "No, you can't," said George impolitely. "Not here, because we don't wash dishes or wipe them either. We scour and clean and sterilize them with hot steam in that thing." He pointed out a big aluminum box over beyond the cupboards. "It's near where your dishes come back from the dining room, and also near where you finish cooking. When you've emptied them, they don't have to be scraped. You put them in racks, shut the door, and turn a valve handle. In a few minutes, they're clean and dry. Everything that came off of them is drained into a pan at the bottom, where it can be emptied with the rest of the garbage." George had been doing some rehearsing himself. Always the process of conducting Melissa through her transfigured kitchen and explaining his wonders had been accompanied by a continuous gurgle of wonder and delight from her. There had not been much of that so far. And just now she was standing with her back to him, looking out the window. But with the blind enthusiasm of a fanatic, he plunged ahead just the same. He explained the method of converting electric current into heat, apologized for it, and admitted its fearful inefficiency. The amount of heat you got out of a pound of coal by making it into steam and then into electricity and then back into heat again was terribly small compared with what you got by burning it direct. But you got it exactly when and where you wanted it. You could regulate it to a degree and time it to a minute. "If you're off on a visit," he instanced, "I can have the house just warm enough to keep the pipes from freezing, except while I'm here myself." "Of course," said Melissa queerly, "I can go away whenever you want me to." This was so silly and so preposterous that he did not even try to answer it, but went ahead with his explanation. He explained the thermostat, which turned on the current when the temperature fell below a certain point and turned it off again when it had risen above. He explained its combination with the clock, so the heat could be turned on at a certain time, a certain temperature maintained for a certain time, and then the current turned off again. That's the principle we've applied here in the kitchen, and it certainly makes cooking about the simplest thing in the world. Any child with skill enough Any child with skill enough to turn a switch and arithmetic enough to subtract an hour and a quarter from 7 o'clock can do it. You know the proper degree of temperature and the length of time it takes to roast a 5-pound leg of mutton, say. "I don't," said Melissa. "No cook does. You have to look and see how it's getting on." "It's determined experimentally in the first place," he admitted, "and written down in the cookbook. Then you set your clock and your thermostat, and the thing is done at the time you want dinner. You can get it ready whenever you like, the first thing in the morning if you want to, and go away and be gone all day." "I see," sniffed Melissa. George did not. He walked over to the glass shelf where his row of ovens stood. There were 3 of them, accessible, heat-proof, like a fireless cooker, movable. He explained their wonders, but Melissa stayed where she was at the window. There was a frying pan for scrambled eggs and griddle cakes, and things like that, with a ventilating hood over it to carry all the odors away. And then there was his special pride, a new sort of broiler. The point of it was that you put your steak in edgewise, with the fat edge up, and applied the heat to both sides at once. In that way, the juices ran over the whole surface instead of falling straight into the fire, and then dropped into a porcelain boat below. The thing was cooked twice as quickly, and you didn't have to turn it over. He wasted a pleading look on Melissa's back, then went to the other end of the kitchen, where the butler's pantry had been. There were 3 tea wagons standing there in a row, like fire engines in a station. Over each was a big shiny metal hood on a spring hinge. "We might have had these in the dining room," said George. "Jerry wanted to, but I was a little afraid of making it look like a lunch counter, so I kept them out here. 2 of these hoods keep things hot, and the other keeps them cold. When you pull the hood down and clamp it over the edge of the wagon, it turns on. When your dinner is ready to serve, you put 1 course on each wagon, pull the hood over it, and when you're ready, wheel it all in. By putting the soup on the table in an electrically heated tureen, you can have 3 courses after it without any delay at all. 4 courses are enough for anybody. And, well, there you are." He lighted a cigarette and took a couple of puffs as if his throat were tired. What in thunder was Melissa doing with her handkerchief? She'd not caught cold, had she? She could not be. "Of course," he went on soothingly, "some of the details may seem a bit complicated at first, but the principle is as simple as ABC, flexible and discontinuous." "If you say that again," said Melissa in a suppressed voice, "I shall scream." "All right," said George, "but it's what I mean. You have what you want when you want it. You don't have to stay round and wait to get it done. I've been doing all the housework, and for the last 4 days, since the system's been in running order, it's taken me just over an hour a day. Even if I were busy, I could afford that much time in case you wanted to go away anywhere. So you see, it leaves us really independent, and that's what I started out to do." "What you started out to do," sobbed Melissa as she turned tragically and faced him, "was to get rid of me. What have you been telling me over and over again, except how finely you could get on when I was away on a visit? What's the good of being married to me? Why don't you just turn me out of the house in so many words and go on being flexible and discontinuous all by yourself? What is there for me to do? Do you suppose I could ever learn to run all this machinery? Worms and thermostats and operating tables? Do you suppose any cook ever could?" "Well," said George, after he had consumed half a cigarette in stupefied silence, I suppose I could advertise for a chauffeur who had lost his license for speeding. He might be willing to tackle the job. I'll tell you this, said Melissa. I won't go away. Visits indeed. I'll stay right here. I may not have anything to do, and you and your horrible chauffeur may not want me, but I'll stay. Do you now? Do you know? Said George after a few meditative puffs, and now Melissa could see that he had begun to smile. Do you know? That is what I had sort of figured out. I hope that if you could go away whenever you liked, it might not seem quite such a chore to stay and keep me company. Because he threw away his cigarette, went over to where she was, and got hold of one of her hands and rubbed his cheek against it. Because I've been as lonesome as the very devil for the last 3 months, Melissa. They made a call that evening on Florence and Jerry. Florence was bewailing the fate that consigned her to 3 mortal, everlasting hours at the tailor's the next day, getting fitted. He's the best there is, she said, and he simply makes your clothes on you. And Madame Dufault is worse. It's horrible. I never have time to read or go to concerts or anything. Clothes are such a bore. I know, said George sympathetically. It's the same way with Melissa. She gets so worn out getting her clothes that she hasn't any fun wearing them. And then his face brightened and he shot a look at Jerry. Do you know, I believe dressmakers are as far behind the game as cooks. I believe if the problem of women's clothes were approached scientifically, one could George, said Melissa, stop it. If you ever start in to make my clothes flexible and discontinuous or automatically and interchangeable, I'll go back to mother's and I'll stay. Oh, all right, said George sulkily. All the same. I mean it, said Melissa. The end.